In 2022, Xi Jinping stood on the deck of a vessel in the Yellow Sea and looked out at something that should not, stretching across the water in every direction, as far as the eye could follow, were structures. Not ships, not oil platforms, not anything that had a name in any previous maritime engineering manual. Enormous steel rings, each one over 100 meters across, floating in open ocean dozens of kilometers from the nearest shore, anchored to the seabed, tethered together in formations that from the surface looked almost accidental, but from the air resolved into a pattern of extraordinary precision. Inside each ring, below the waterline, tens of thousands of fish were growing. Not in a tank, not in an enclosed space. In the open ocean, in water that moved with the currents and the tides, in conditions that mimicked the natural environment of wild fish so closely that the fish themselves behaved differently than any farmed fish in any land-based or coastal facility had ever behaved before. The salmon inside these rings were growing faster than wild salmon. The sea bass were reaching harvest weight in less time than any farmed sea bass on record, and the water quality inside the rings, measured continuously by sensors feeding data to shore facilities in real time, was cleaner in some parameters than the open ocean surrounding them. This was not a prototype. This was a commercial operation producing food at a scale that, when the full program reaches completion, will be visible from orbit. My name is Adi Mel, and this is exactly the kind of story that should be in every newspaper on Earth and is somehow in almost none of them. If you are new here, subscribe to Adi Mel right now and hit the like button. Every week we go this deep on the breakthroughs that are actually changing the world while everyone is looking somewhere else. Turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear changes how you think about where food comes from and how much of it there actually is. Now, let us start with the problem, because the ocean farming story only makes sense if you understand what it was built to solve. The world is running out of fish, not in the distant future, not as a projection on a graph that curves downward sometime after 2050. Right now, in the waters that have fed human civilizations for 10,000 years. The fish are disappearing at a rate that marine biologists describe not as a trend but as a collapse, a word they use with precision because collapse has a specific meaning in ecology that is different from decline. A population decline means numbers are falling, but the ecosystem remains functional. A collapse means the population has fallen below the threshold at which it can sustain itself through reproduction. Once a fish population collapses, it does not recover on a human timescale, even if all fishing stops immediately. The Atlantic cod population off the coast of Canada collapsed in 1992. More than 30 years later, with fishing restrictions still in place across most of its former range, it has not recovered. The fish that were there are gone. The ecosystem that depended on them has reorganized around their absence. The Atlantic cod collapse was one species in one region. What is happening globally is broader, faster, and harder to reverse. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that over 35% of the world's commercially important fish stocks are currently being fished at biologically unsustainable levels. Another 60% are being fished at their maximum sustainable capacity, meaning any increase in fishing pressure pushes them toward the same trajectory. Less than 10% of global fish stocks have any meaningful room for increased harvesting. This matters for reasons that go far beyond the economics of the fishing industry. Fish is the primary source of animal protein for over 3 billion people. Not a significant source, the primary source. In coastal communities across South and Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Pacific Islands, fish is not a dietary option. It is the nutritional foundation that everything else is built around. When fish populations decline, the communities that depend on them face a protein deficit that cannot simply be substituted with another food source, because the other food sources are not available, affordable, or culturally appropriate in the places where the need is most acute. At the same time, global demand for seafood is rising, not slowly. The middle class in Asia, a population that has historically eaten significant quantities of fish, is growing at a pace that translates into hundreds of millions of new consumers entering fish markets over the next 2 decades. Economic development in coastal African and Southeast Asian countries is producing similar demand growth. The global seafood market is projected to grow by over 60% between 2020 and 2050, at the same time that the wild supply is contracting. The gap between what the ocean can sustainably provide and what the world is going to need is not a gap that can be closed by fishing more carefully. The math does not work even with perfect fisheries management globally, which has never existed and is not being approached. The gap can only be closed by growing food in the ocean rather than extracting it. This is what aquaculture was supposed to do, and for decades aquaculture did grow fast. Global fish farming production has increased roughly 15-fold since 1980. Today, farmed fish accounts for approximately half of all seafood consumed globally. By that measure, aquaculture has been one of the great food production success stories of the modern era. But conventional aquaculture has its own severe problems, and those problems are what made the Chinese ocean farming program necessary in the first place. Most fish farming in the world is done in one of two ways. Either in tanks on land, controlled environments where water quality, temperature, and feeding can be managed precisely, but where the cost of maintaining those conditions is high and the scale is limited by the availability of land and the energy required to run the systems. Or in net pens in coastal water, enclosures anchored in sheltered bays and fjords and estuaries where fish can be kept in large numbers at relatively low cost. The coastal net pen approach became the dominant model for salmon farming in Norway, Scotland, Chile, and Canada, and for sea bass, sea bream, and other species in the Mediterranean and in Asia. And it scaled rapidly because the economics were compelling. Coastal water is free. Net pens are relatively cheap to build. The fish are close to shore, which makes feeding and monitoring and harvesting logistically manageable. The problems with coastal net pens became apparent at scale and have never been fully solved. The first problem is waste. A large salmon farming operation in a sheltered coastal bay produces enormous quantities of fish feces, uneaten feed, and chemical treatments that accumulate on the seabed directly below the pens. In a sheltered bay with limited water circulation, this waste does not disperse. It builds up, depleting oxygen in the sediment, killing benthic organisms, and creating dead zones on the seafloor that can persist for years after a farm is removed. The nutrient load from large farms can trigger algal blooms in the surrounding water that harm wild species and create conditions toxic to the farmed fish themselves. The second problem is disease. High-density conditions in enclosed net pens create ideal conditions for the spread of parasites and pathogens. Sea lice, microscopic crustaceans that attach to fish and feed on their skin and mucus, are the most pervasive problem in salmon farming globally and have proved extraordinarily difficult to control at scale. Chemical treatments for sea lice are effective against the parasites, but harm other crustaceans in the surrounding environment, including wild populations of shrimp and crabs. Biological controls using cleaner fish have been deployed, but do not fully solve the problem. Sea lice from farmed salmon escape into the surrounding water and infect wild salmon populations, passing through the same coastal areas, which is one of the factors contributing to the decline of wild Atlantic salmon runs in Scotland and Norway. The third problem is location. The best sites for coastal net pen aquaculture, sheltered bays with good water flow, suitable depth, and accessible infrastructure, are limited in number and concentrated in specific geographical regions. They are also sites that compete with other uses: recreation, wild fisheries, tourism, conservation. In many countries, the expansion of coastal aquaculture has slowed or stopped, not because the technology reached its limits, but because the available suitable sites have been used up and regulatory pressure against placing new farms in sensitive coastal areas has grown. For China specifically, the coastal aquaculture problem was acute. China is the world's largest seafood producer and consumer by a significant margin. Chinese coastal aquaculture, shrimp, shellfish, seaweed, and fish, accounts for a substantial portion of global farmed seafood production. But China's coastal waters are among the most heavily used in the world. Shipping lanes, port facilities, urban development, and existing aquaculture installations already occupy most of the suitable coastal area. Pollution from industrial and agricultural runoff has degraded water quality across significant stretches of the Chinese coastline, to the point where expanding coastal fish farming is not just environmentally problematic. In some areas, it is operationally impossible because the water is not clean enough to raise fish in. The answer that Chinese engineers and marine scientists began developing in the mid-2010s was to move the farms off the coast entirely. Not to larger coastal facilities, not to more remote coastal sites. Out into the open ocean, into water that was deep, clean, constantly moving, and essentially unlimited in extent, and that nobody had ever seriously attempted to use for large-scale fish farming before, for reasons that were entirely legitimate until someone figured out how to address them. The open ocean is hostile to fixed structures in a way that coastal waters are not. In a sheltered bay, a net pen faces wave heights measured in fractions of a meter, current speeds that are gentle, and weather conditions that occasionally become difficult but that the structure can be built to handle with conventional marine engineering. The forces involved are manageable because the environment is, by definition, sheltered. The open ocean is the opposite of sheltered. Wave heights in the Yellow Sea, the body of water where China's first major deep-water aquaculture installations were built, can reach 8 meters during typhoon season. Current speeds are variable and can be strong. The structures have to survive not just the average conditions, but the worst conditions that occur over a 30-year operational lifespan, because a structure that fails in a storm does not just lose the capital investment in the structure itself. It releases tens of thousands of fish into the open ocean, potentially spreading disease to wild populations, and it creates a navigation hazard in a busy shipping area. Conventional net pen design cannot be scaled to survive these conditions. The nets that work in a sheltered Norwegian fjord would be torn apart in an open ocean typhoon. The mooring systems that hold coastal installations in place are not designed for the depth, the current variability, or the surge forces of open ocean conditions. And the structural rings or frames that support the nets, typically simple steel or plastic hoops in coastal facilities, would be catastrophically deformed by the bending forces imposed by large ocean waves if simply scaled up in size. The engineering team at the Chinese company CNFC Ocean Fisheries, working in collaboration with research groups at the Ocean University of China and with naval architecture specialists who had previously worked on offshore oil platform design, approached the problem by abandoning the assumption that an aquaculture structure should be rigid. Rigid structures survive ocean forces by being strong enough to resist them. This works up to a certain scale, but the amount of material required to make a rigid structure strong enough to survive open ocean conditions scales faster than the size of the structure, meaning that beyond a certain point, making a rigid structure bigger makes it proportionally heavier and more expensive without proportionally increasing its production capacity. The economics stop working. The alternative approach, the one that the Chinese engineering team developed, was to make the structure compliant, not rigid. Designed to move with the forces acting on it rather than resist them. The same principle that allows suspension bridges to survive winds that would destroy arch bridges. The same principle that allows tall buildings in earthquake zones to sway rather than snap. The large steel rings that Xi Jinping saw from the deck of his vessel in 2022 are not fixed. They are designed to flex. The steel used in their construction is a high-tensile marine-grade alloy that bends under load and returns to shape, within engineering limits that were established through years of wave tank testing and finite element modeling, rather than holding rigid and accumulating fatigue damage at stress concentration points. The mooring system uses a spread mooring configuration with synthetic fiber ropes that have controlled elasticity, absorbing surge forces rather than transmitting them directly to the structure. The net itself, the containment system inside the ring that actually holds the fish, is made from an ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene fiber that is stronger by weight than steel cable, resistant to UV degradation and biofouling, and flexible enough to move with the currents passing through it without developing the pressure differentials that cause conventional net pens to deform and lose volume during strong currents. The result of all of this engineering was a structure that could be deployed in water depths of 50 to 100 meters, survive typhoon force conditions without structural damage, and maintain sufficient net volume to hold the target fish population throughout the full range of environmental conditions it would encounter. The first full-scale prototype, a ring 120 meters in diameter with a net volume of approximately 90,000 cubic meters, was deployed in the Yellow Sea in 2018. It survived its first typhoon season intact. It survived its second. The fish inside it grew. The results from the first operational deepwater aquaculture installations in China surprised almost everyone, including the researchers who had designed them. The expectation going in was that deep-water ocean farming would be harder than coastal farming, more expensive to operate, more difficult to manage, more vulnerable to the unpredictability of open ocean conditions. The deep water was chosen because the coastal alternative had run out of room, not because anyone expected it to produce better fish faster. What actually happened was different. The fish grew faster. Not slightly faster, meaningfully faster. Large yellow croaker, one of the first species farmed commercially in the deep water facilities, reached market weight in approximately 18 months in the open ocean installations compared to the 24 to 27 months typical in coastal facilities for the same species. The current of water flowing continuously through the compliant net system meant the fish were swimming against a gentle but constant resistance, the same way wild fish do. The muscle development that resulted produced flesh quality, texture, fat distribution, flavor, that professional tasters and blind evaluations rated consistently higher than either coastal farmed fish or, in several tests, wild-caught fish of the same species. The explanation for the faster growth and superior quality converged on the water itself. In a coastal net pen, the water circulates but not fast enough. Waste products accumulate. Dissolved oxygen levels drop in the lower portions of the pen during warm months. The fish respond to these suboptimal conditions the way any organism responds to chronic low-level stress, by diverting energy towards survival rather than growth. They eat more than they convert to body mass. Their immune systems work harder, making them more susceptible to disease outbreaks that then require chemical intervention. In a deep-water, open ocean installation, the water flowing through the net is the actual ocean. It is constantly replenished. Waste is dispersed before it can accumulate. Dissolved oxygen levels remain high throughout the water column. The temperature is stable. Deep ocean water is buffered against the surface temperature swings that stress coastal fish through summer heat events. The fish are, in physiological terms, in an environment that resembles what their bodies were evolved for. The sea lice problem, the parasite that has cost the global salmon farming industry billions of dollars and decades of failed chemical and biological interventions, does not occur in the deep-water open ocean facilities at the same severity as in coastal farms. The mechanism is not fully understood, but researchers believe it is related to the constant water movement, which prevents the surface water aggregations where sea lice larvae concentrate, and to the salinity and temperature profiles of deep-water sites, which are less favorable to lice reproduction than the brackish, warmer coastal environments where the parasite thrives. The feed conversion ratio, the amount of feed required to produce a kilogram of fish, improved significantly compared to coastal operations. Less feed wasted. Less feed sinking uneaten to the seabed. More feed converted to fish. In an industry where feed typically accounts for 50 to 60% of total operating costs, an improvement in feed conversion ratio is not a minor technical detail. It is a fundamental shift in the economics of production. By 2023, 5 years after the first prototype deployment, China had approximately 20 large deepwater aquaculture installations operational across the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, and the northern South China Sea. The aggregate net volume of fish being produced in these installations exceeded what had been produced by the entire Norwegian salmon farming industry in its most productive year. And the expansion program had not yet reached half of its planned deployment. The phrase visible from space is used loosely in a lot of contexts where it is technically true, but practically meaningless. A large building is visible from space in the sense that it shows up as a few pixels on a satellite image if you know exactly where to look. The deepwater aquaculture installations in the Yellow Sea show up differently. The Yellow Sea sits between the Chinese mainland and the Korean peninsula and is one of the most intensively used bodies of water in the world, dense with shipping traffic, fishing vessels, and coastal infrastructure that is visible and identifiable on commercial satellite imagery. Against that background, The aquaculture installations appear as structured geometric patterns that are immediately distinguishable from anything else in the image. Regular circular forms, consistently spaced, arranged in grid patterns that extend across areas measured in tens of square kilometers. A satellite image of a major installation cluster near Shandong province from 2024 shows a formation of 47 rings deployed across an area of approximately 80 square kilometers. The individual rings are clearly visible. The mooring lines connecting them to each other and to the seabed anchor points appear as faint lines between the circles. The service vessels that move between the rings to deliver feed and perform maintenance show up as small moving objects whose wakes are visible in high-resolution imagery. This is not what aquaculture has ever looked like before. Coastal net pens are tucked into bays and fjords and are frequently invisible in satellite imagery unless you are looking specifically for them. The open ocean installations are not hidden. They are not trying to be. They occupy open water that was previously empty of any structure, and their scale is large enough that they function as navigational landmarks, charted on maritime navigation systems and visible to vessels passing through the area. The Chinese Maritime Administration has established exclusion zones around the major installation clusters and has updated navigation charts to reflect their presence. International maritime organizations have been notified. The installations are a permanent feature of the seascape in a way that no previous aquaculture operation has. The satellite visibility is partly a consequence of scale and partly a consequence of the specific installation geometry. The compliant ring structures, floating at or near the surface with their upper edges above the waterline, have a radar cross-section large enough to be detected by maritime surveillance systems independently of optical satellite imagery. This means they show up on shipping traffic management systems as fixed obstacles and are tracked by the same systems that track vessels. For the operators of the installations, this visibility is not a problem, it is a feature. A fish farm that can be monitored from satellite imagery is a farm that external parties can verify is where it says it is, producing what it says it is producing, and operating in the manner it is required to operate. In an industry where the opacity of production conditions has historically been a significant regulatory and reputational challenge, the enforced visibility of deep ocean installations changes the accountability structure in ways that benefit responsible operators. China's investment in deep-water ocean aquaculture is not primarily driven by environmental considerations, though the environmental advantages over coastal farming are real and significant. It is driven by food security arithmetic that the Chinese government has been running for at least a decade. China has 1.4 billion people to feed. Its arable land per capita is among the lowest of any major country. Its coastal waters are among the most heavily exploited in the world. Its wild fish catch, which peaked in the 1990s, has been declining despite regulatory interventions, and the decline is projected to continue regardless of policy because the underlying fish stock depletion is too advanced to reverse quickly. At the same time, Chinese seafood consumption is rising with income. The dietary transition that accompanies economic development, from grain-heavy diets toward higher protein consumption, is running through a population of 1.4 billion people simultaneously. The demand projections do not require any assumptions about changing preferences. They simply reflect what happens when hundreds of millions of people who are currently at an income level where fish is an occasional food move to an income level where it is a regular food. The gap between China's current domestic seafood production capacity and its projected domestic demand by 2040 is a number that Chinese food security planners do not discuss publicly in its full detail. But the investment levels being directed toward deep-water aquaculture, the government subsidies, the state-backed financing for installation deployment, the research funding, the maritime law frameworks being rewritten to accommodate open ocean aquaculture at scale, suggest that the number is significant enough to drive policy at a national strategic level. The deep-water Yellow Sea installations, when the current expansion program is complete, are projected to produce approximately 8 million metric tons of seafood annually. 8 million metric tons. The total global wild tuna catch, one of the most heavily fished species groups in the world, is approximately 6 million metric tons per year. The deep-water Chinese aquaculture program, from facilities that did not exist a decade ago, will produce more food from the ocean than the entire world catches of one of the most important wild species groups. That number is large enough that it does not just affect Chinese food security. It affects global seafood markets. It affects the economics of aquaculture investment in other countries. It affects the regulatory frameworks that international organizations use to govern ocean use. It affects the diplomatic relationships between China and neighboring countries that share the Yellow Sea and the East China Sea, because the placement of permanent large-scale food production infrastructure in shared maritime zones raises questions about rights and precedents that international maritime law was not designed to address. China is not the only country developing deep-water aquaculture technology, but it is operating at a scale and pace that makes the comparison with other national programs difficult to make without the numbers looking embarrassing for everyone else. Norway, the country with the world's most technically sophisticated salmon farming industry, has been developing offshore aquaculture concepts since the mid-2010s. The SalMar Ocean Farm, deployed in Norwegian waters in 2017, was one of the first large-scale open-ocean aquaculture structures ever built and represented a genuine engineering achievement. It holds approximately 1 million salmon in a structure 68 meters in diameter. It survived Norwegian winter storms that would have destroyed conventional net pens. The fish grew well, and the disease and parasite pressures were measurably lower than in coastal operations. But Norway has one SalMar Ocean Farm. China has dozens of structures larger than it and a deployment program that is adding new installations faster than the Norwegian program has added capacity in 7 years of operation. The Norwegian program is scientifically rigorous and technically impressive. The Chinese program is scientifically rigorous, technically impressive, and operating at a completely different scale. In the United States, offshore aquaculture has been discussed, researched, piloted, and stalled in regulatory and political processes for decades. The regulatory framework governing offshore aquaculture in U.S. federal waters, the area beyond 3 miles from shore where the federal government, rather than individual states, has jurisdiction, was not finalized until 2024. Meaning that commercial-scale offshore aquaculture in U.S. federal waters has been legally ambiguous for most of the period during which China was building its first installations, running them through typhoon seasons, learning from operational experience, and expanding the fleet. The regulatory clarity that now exists in the U.S. is a genuine step forward, but the gap in operational experience and deployed capacity between the U.S. and China in offshore aquaculture is measured in years and in millions of tons of annual production capacity. In Japan, deep-water aquaculture research has been ongoing at several universities and at government fisheries research institutes for over a decade. Japanese marine engineering companies have developed prototype open-ocean cage structures with sophisticated monitoring systems. But domestic deployment at commercial scale has been slowed by the complexity of permitting in Japan's heavily regulated coastal zone management framework and by the cautious investment culture of Japanese aquaculture operators who have less urgent pressure to expand rapidly than their Chinese counterparts. The countries in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines, that have significant coastal aquaculture industries and strong domestic demand for seafood are watching the Chinese program closely. Several have sent technical delegations to observe Chinese installations and have begun regulatory discussions about frameworks for offshore aquaculture in their own exclusive economic zones. The Chinese government, through its fisheries cooperation programs, has offered technical assistance to several Southeast Asian countries interested in developing their own offshore aquaculture capability. This pattern, China develops a technology at scale, demonstrates it works, then offers the technology and expertise to other countries through bilateral cooperation programs, has become familiar across many sectors. In offshore aquaculture, the sequence is playing out clearly, and the implications for regional food security in Southeast Asia, where wild fish stock depletion is severe and coastal aquaculture is running out of room, are potentially significant. Behind all of the engineering specifications and the food security calculations and the satellite imagery, the deep-water ocean farming story is ultimately a story about fish, about what fish need to grow and be healthy, and about what happens when you give it to them. There is a fisheries biologist named Dr. Lu Wei at the Ocean University of China who has spent the last 8 years studying the fish in the deep water installations. Her work is not about engineering. It is about animal behavior and physiology, about what the fish are doing inside those rings and what that tells you about whether what you have built is actually working. One of the things she documented in the early years of the program was that the fish in the deep water installations were schooling differently than coastal farmed fish school. Wild fish school move together in coordinated groups for reasons that are not fully understood, but that are associated with predator avoidance, feeding efficiency, and environmental navigation. Coastal farmed fish in high-density net pens school poorly or not at all. The density is too high, the space too constrained, the environment too uniform. Fish in coastal facilities often show stereotypic behaviors, repetitive, purposeless movements that are the aquatic equivalent of the pacing behavior seen in zoo animals kept in inadequate enclosures. These behaviors are stress indicators. They correlate with elevated cortisol levels, suppressed immune function, and reduced growth rates. The fish in the deep water installations were schooling, moving together in coherent groups, responding to the current flowing through the net by orienting collectively and swimming against it, the way wild fish do when holding position in flowing water. The stereotypic behaviors documented in coastal fish were absent or dramatically reduced. This matters beyond the immediate welfare implications. Fish that are not chronically stressed grow faster, convert feed more efficiently, develop better flesh quality, and are more resistant to disease without chemical intervention. The behavioral difference that Dr. Liu documented is not just a scientific curiosity. It is a measurable indicator that the engineering decisions made in designing the open ocean installations, the constant water movement, the compliant structure that moves with the ocean rather than constraining it, the depth and temperature stability of the open ocean environment were producing conditions that were genuinely better for the fish, not just marginally acceptable. Her findings have been cited in subsequent installation design reviews and have influenced decisions about minimum water flow rates, net volume allocations per fish, and stocking density limits across the Chinese deep water program. Science informing engineering, informing fish welfare, informing food quality in a direct, documented, operational feedback loop across a program producing millions of tons of food annually. The fish that grew in the current are healthier. They taste better. They require fewer chemicals to keep them that way. And there are more of them than any previous aquaculture program has ever produced, growing in water that was empty before humans put the rings there, and that will be empty again when the rings are gone. When Xi Jinping stood on that vessel in 2022 and looked out at the rings floating across the Yellow Sea, he was looking at something that did not exist a decade earlier, and that will be producing food for 1 billion people for decades to come. The ocean that humans have been extracting food from since before recorded history, pulling fish out faster than they can reproduce, collapsing stock after stock, depleting ecosystem after ecosystem, is now being used in a different way. Not extraction, production, not taking what is there, growing what is needed. The engineering that makes it possible was not simple. The biology that makes it work better than anyone expected was not obvious. The scale at which it is being deployed is not small, and the implications for global food security, for the future of wild fish populations, for the countries that are watching China build this capacity and deciding whether to follow, those implications are not finished yet. They are just beginning. I want to know what you think. If deep water ocean farming scales to produce a meaningful fraction of global seafood demand, if the rings in the Yellow Sea are the beginning of a transformation in how humans feed themselves from the sea, what happens to the fishing communities that have built their lives around wild catch? Do they adapt, or do they get left behind? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Hit the like button if this story surprised you. Subscribe to Mel if you want to keep finding the stories that matter before the rest of the world figures out they matter. Turn on notifications. Because next week we go just as deep on something just as real and just as consequential. The ocean is being farmed, and it is only just getting started.